The wind came down off the Bitterroot Divide on the second night of February in 1880, sounding like nothing the valley had ever heard before. Not a howl, not a scream, but a long, low freight train roar that did not stop for 96 hours. By the time it broke, 3 of Bannack's frame houses had collapsed under the weight of the snow on their roofs. 2 more had been swallowed altogether. The doctor's wife had lost 3 fingers to the cold. 2 miners had been found stiff in their bunks with their boots still on. And on the north edge of town, half buried in a low rise of fieldstone, everyone in Bannack had walked past for 3 years without a second glance. 12 frost-bitten neighbors were sitting around a small cast-iron stove, alive, warm, and quiet. Sheltered inside a building the entire town had laughed at when an 18-year-old girl with no kin and no coat had first crossed its threshold 3 months earlier. Her name was Cora, and that previous November, the boarding house woman had thrown her trunk into the road over $6 in unpaid rent. She had nothing left but the dress on her back and her grandmother's silver thimble. What she did with the abandoned Icehouse on the north edge of Bannack, and what she taught a settlement that had written her off, is a story that the territorial newspapers would not print, and the family Bibles of 3 valleys would not forget. Before we step into her story, if frontier grit and forgotten ingenuity are your kind of history, hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it tells us to keep digging up these stories the modern world has tried very hard to forget. Bannack sat in a cup of land between the Beaverhead and the Bitterroot Ranges, a placer mining camp grown half into a town and half still into the gravel of Grasshopper Creek. By the autumn of 1879, it had been bleeding men for almost a decade. The rich gold had been pulled from the creek bed by 67, and what was left was the slower, harder kind of mining that took quartz mills and capital and patience, none of which the territory had in abundance. The Goodrich Hotel still stood at the head of Main. 2 stories of square-cut timber painted a defiant white. The Bannack jail still held its iron-strap door shut against the road. The Methodist meeting house at the south end still held services on Sunday for those who could be bothered to come. But the population had thinned to under 400 souls, and most of those 400 had begun looking northward toward the new strikes at Butte, or eastward toward the cattle country opening up along the Yellowstone. In autumn, the wind off the Beaverhead came in cold and dry and smelled of cured grass and smoke from green pine. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brittle yellow that rattled in the gusts before letting go all at once on the first hard frost. Underfoot, the ground was a layer of fine gray dust over a hardpan that took a boot the way an anvil takes a hammer. There was no give in it, and a fall meant a bruise that would last a fortnight. By October, the smoke from 100 green pine fires hung low along Grasshopper Creek every morning until the sun climbed high enough to lift it, and the smell of wood smoke and wet hide and the sour mineral steam from the assayer's office was the smell of the town from one end of Main Street to the other. It was a settlement that knew its own kind. The freight clerk knew which families were behind on their tabs. The preacher knew who had not been to a service since their husband died. The boarding house owner knew to the penny what every lodger owed her, and she remembered the count longer than most people remembered birthdays. New arrivals came in on the stage from Corinne or down the old freight road from Helena, and the town measured them in the first 3 days. What they carried, who met them at the depot, whether the men of the place tipped their hats or only nodded. Outsiders who did not pass that first measurement found themselves sleeping rough by week's end, and the freight clerk did not bother to learn their names. Into this place, on a cold afternoon in the last week of September of that year, the eastbound stage had set down a young woman with a single trunk and an envelope from a man who was not there to receive her. The town had taken her measure that first afternoon and decided by the easy, unspoken arithmetic such places use that she would not last the month. They were wrong about that, and they were wrong about almost everything else they thought they knew about her. but it would be a hard winter before any of them admitted it. Cora Whitfield was 18 years old that September, and she did not look like a woman who had crossed 2,000 miles to be married. She was small, not much over 5 feet, and the thinness in her was the thinness of someone who had eaten 3 meals a day all her life and worked them off honestly, not the brittle thinness of hunger. Her hair was the color of dark river clay, parted in the center and pinned back so plainly that the boarding house women considered the plainness a kind of statement. Her eyes were a flat slate gray that held a person's gaze a little longer than was comfortable, and on the second day, Mrs. Pike at the boarding house remarked to the freight clerk that the girl had the kind of look that had already done the math on a room before she stepped fully into it. Her hands were not the hands of a parlor girl. The knuckles were a little broad, the nails were short and clean, and there was a faint pale scar across the meat of her right thumb where a paring knife had once slipped some years earlier. In the cold, she wore a plain wool walking dress in a color between brown and gray, a single dark shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and a pair of worked leather boots that were 2 seasons past needing the heels mended. Her one defining feature, the thing the boarding house women noticed first, and the men of the town admitted last, was a small, high-boned set to her face that did not soften when she was tired, did not soften when she was hungry, and did not soften when Mrs. Pike threw her trunk into the dust of the road. She had been raised in a clapboard farmhouse outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, the only daughter of a widowed wheelwright who had kept her at his elbow from the time she could walk. Her mother had died of childbed fever when Cora was 3, and the house had been run after that by her grandmother, a tall, narrow Pennsylvania Dutch woman named Greta, who had cooked, mended, gardened, smoked hams, made soap, rendered tallow, woven rag rugs, and worked through 100 other small kingdoms of household labor in the slow, patient, methodical way of the old country. Greta had taught her granddaughter how to do all of it, and Greta had also taught her the one habit that the women of Bannack would later mistake for arrogance, the habit of looking at a problem from 3 sides before lifting a finger to solve it. The wheelwright father had taught her the rest. From him she had learned how a wheel held its load, how a joint held its strain, how a piece of green oak would warp and a piece of seasoned cedar would not, and how to read the run of the grain in a board the way a literate person reads a sentence. She had spent her childhood handing tools up to a man working under a wagon, and her girlhood watching him swing a maul at a froe and split a 6-foot length of straight-grained ash into shake stock as cleanly as another man might cut a sheet of paper. By 15, she could shape a fellow. By 16, she could set a tire, none of which she could have admitted on the stage from Corinne without inviting the wrong sort of attention. Her father had died of a chest fever in the spring of 79. And the wheelwright shop had been bought by a man who did not need a girl in the workplace. The promised marriage had come through a circular advertised in a Davenport paper, and the man on the other end of the correspondence, a freighting partner of some indeterminate enterprise out of Bannack, had sent her enough to come west, with the understanding that the rest would be settled when they met. He never met her. The freight clerk would tell her 3 days later that the man had taken a contract north toward Helena in August and had not been heard from since, and that the freight company considered him a dead account. Cora listened to this without changing her expression, thanked the clerk, and walked back to the boarding house in the cold afternoon light with the arithmetic of her situation working quietly in her head. What she carried in the way of capital was almost nothing. A trunk holding 2 changes of clothing, a winter cloak that was already too thin for what was coming, a Bible with her grandmother's name in the front, a packet of letters from the dead man, $4.73 in coin, and a small silver thimble her grandmother had pressed into her palm the morning she left Cedar Falls. The vulnerability the town saw in her was the obvious one, a young unmarried woman alone, in a hard place, with no kin, no employer, and no protector. The vulnerability she carried inside herself was a quieter one. She had never in her life slept a single night in a building she did not know. Mrs. Pike kept the second largest boarding house in Bannack, and the only one a respectable young woman could be sent to without inviting talk. She was a wide, square-set widow of about 50, with a face the color of new brick and a voice that carried clear across a dining room without rising. She had buried 2 husbands and outlived 4 of her own brothers. And the experience had given her a sort of unsentimental clarity about money that the town respected without exactly liking. She gave Cora a room on the 3rd floor, really an attic with a sloped ceiling and a single dormer window, and made it clear on the very first evening that the rate was $1.50 a week, payable on Saturday in coin, before breakfast. For 3 weeks, Cora paid. She mended. She offered to mend the lodgers' shirts at 15 cents a garment, and within 10 days the freight men were leaving their cuffs and collars on the side table outside her room each evening. She offered to do alterations for the women of the town at $0.25 apiece, and got 2 dresses in the first week. Then no more, because the women of the town had decided to take her measure further before letting her near their good linen. By the end of the 3rd week, she had earned $6.25 and paid out $4.50 in rent, and her $4.73 of seed money was stretched another fortnight thin. By the end of the 5th week, the mending had dried up. The freight men paid late or not at all. The 2 paying customers had taken their dresses and not returned. October had turned cold, and the boarders were no longer interested in altering summer linens. On Saturday, the 7th of November, with the first snow already on the high pasture above the creek, Cora came down the stairs in the cold gray light of 7 in the morning to find her trunk standing in the road in front of the boarding house, and Mrs. Pike standing beside it with her arms folded across her bosom, and an expression that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but lay heavily, as if it cost her nothing, somewhere between the two. $6.25, Mrs. Pike said. I have been more than patient. You may collect what you can carry. The rest I shall hold against the bill. There is a Wednesday stage to Corinne if you mean to take it. There is a missionary lady there who places girls in your circumstance, I have heard. Cora stood on the porch in the cold and looked at the trunk in the road and at the woman beside it. She did not argue, did not weep, did not raise her voice. She came down the steps and knelt by the trunk with her bare hands red in the cold and unfastened the buckles. She took out her grandmother's Bible and the letters and the woolen cloak and a clean apron and her grandmother's silver thimble in its small chamois pouch, and she folded these into the cloak and tied the cloak with a length of twine she pulled from her own apron string. Mrs. Pike watched the whole operation without moving. The freight clerk Buford Hayes, on his way up Main to open the stage office, slowed his step on the boardwalk to watch as well. And so did the doctor's wife, Lavinia Crane, on her way back from the bake oven with a covered basket. None of them spoke. Cora rose, slung the bundle over her shoulder, took one long, even breath, and walked north up Main Street out of the boarding house yard and out of Mrs. Pike's life and, the town assumed, out of Bannack altogether. She did not take the Wednesday stage. By midday on the 7th of November, she was sitting on a flat fieldstone at the north edge of town with her bundle in her lap and her breath going up white in the cold air, looking at a low, half-buried structure of fieldstone and beam that nobody in the settlement had walked into in 3 years. And by the time the snow came that November in earnest, she had nothing left but a piece of land nobody wanted, a building everybody had forgotten, and the strange, half-formed idea that had been growing in the back of her head since the moment she had first seen the place from the road 2 weeks earlier, on an errand to the freight depot. The Icehouse had been built in 1872 by a partnership of 3 Bannack merchants who meant to supply the saloons and the hotel through the summer months from ice cut on Grasshopper Creek every February. It had run for 3 winters and 1 summer at a profit, and then in '76, the Utah and Northern had reached far enough north to begin shipping commercial sawdust-packed ice down from the Snake River country at half the price. The partnership had dissolved without ceremony. The Icehouse had been emptied of its last block of dirty ice in the August of '76 and locked. The lock had been pried off by boys within the year. The interior had been used briefly as a place for the rougher element to drink out of the wind, and then even that had stopped, because the place was cold even in July and uncomfortable to sit in long, and because there was no profit in it for anyone. By the autumn of '79, it was so thoroughly part of the landscape on the north edge of town that Buford Hayes asked later what he had thought when he first heard a young woman meant to live in it, said he had to think for a full minute before he could place which building was meant. It was a single rectangle, 22 feet long by 14 feet wide on the inside, set into the south slope of a low rise, with the floor sunk 3 feet below the level of the ground outside. The walls were fieldstone laid up in a rough lime mortar, 2.5 feet thick at the base and tapering to 2 feet at the 8-foot wall plate. The roof was hand-riven cedar shakes over heavy pine purlins, mounded over with 1.5 feet of earth and grass to keep the summer sun from reaching the ice below. The door was on the north end, a heavy plank and batten affair hung on iron strap hinges, set in a deep stone-framed reveal. Above the door, 8 feet up the gable wall, there was a single ice-loading hatch the size of a small window. There was no glazing. There was no chimney. There was a single ventilation shaft set in the south gable. An 8x8 box of stone running up through the earth roof to a small louvered cap, designed to draw warm summer air out the top, while the cold air pooled at the floor, beneath the ice. Cora sat on the fieldstone outside the Icehouse for the better part of an hour on the 7th of November, before she stood up, walked to the door, pushed it open against 3 years of drifted leaves and dust, and stepped inside. The cold of the place hit her through the thin cloak like a hand against her chest. The interior was dim. The packed earth floor was hard as cement, swept smooth by the boots of generations of ice cutters, and unbroken by any furniture or fixture except a single low limestone shelf that ran the length of the east wall, 3 feet wide, 2 feet off the floor. The shelf the workmen had once used to set their lanterns and their lunch pails on while they stacked the ice. The walls were dry. The roof had not leaked. The air smelled of stone and old sawdust and nothing else. What every other person in Bannack had seen, looking at the building, was the thing it was built for. A cold storage shell, dark and damp and useful for one purpose, for one season of the year, and useless for all the others. What Cora had seen as she walked back from the freight depot the first time and slowed her step, and again the second time and slowed her step again, and now standing inside the cold, dim rectangle with her hand on the limestone shelf, was a different building altogether. The walls that were thick enough to hold cold against summer were thick enough to hold heat against winter. The earth-mounted roof that kept the sun out would keep the wind off. The sunk floor was below the frost line. The ventilation shaft, designed to vent cold air upward, would do exactly the same job for the smoke of a small stove. The ice-loading hatch was a wound in the building's heat envelope, but it was a wound the size of a small window, and any fool with a froe and a bucket of clay could close it. The door faced north, which was bad, but a windbreak of stacked cordwood and a second inner door of plank would handle the worst of it. The whole building, in fact, was already 3/4 of a winter house. It only needed someone to invert its purpose. She set her bundle on the limestone shelf, drew her wool cloak around her against the cold, and stood for a long minute looking up at the timber of the purlins. Then she went back outside, walked the perimeter, counted the courses of fieldstone, paced the distance from the door to the freight road, and returned at last to the door. From her cloak she took out her grandmother's silver thimble, slipped it onto the third finger of her right hand, and pushed the door of the Icehouse closed behind her with her shoulder. That afternoon, With a borrowed hatchet she paid a dime to use, she cut her first armload of cottonwood from the deadfall along Grasshopper Creek and carried it back to the Icehouse, and laid the first piece down inside the doorway as a sill. The town did not know she had done it. The town would not know for the better part of a week. By then, she had been 4 nights in the building, and her thimble had already been pressed into 100 small, useful things. Her first object was warmth, and her first warmth came from the body, from labor, and from a single small fire built in the open doorway and vented out the door so as not to fill the building with smoke. For 4 days, she did nothing inside the Icehouse but observe the place, where the cold drafted in along the floor, where the warmer air she breathed pooled at the eaves, how long after sundown the stone walls held the heat of her small fire, how the packed earth floor took footprints. She slept those 4 nights wrapped in her cloak on the limestone shelf with her bundle for a pillow, and she ate nothing the first night, half a heel of bread the second, and a scoop of cornmeal mush cooked over the doorway fire the third and fourth, traded for a half-day's mending at a freighter's wagon down by the corral. On the 5th morning, with her plans settled and her tools assembled, she began the work in earnest. The tools she begged or borrowed or traded for, one by one, over the next 10 days. From a German immigrant blacksmith named Otto Reichert at the south end of town, she got the loan of a felling axe, a froe, a heavy wooden mallet, a small adze, and a draw knife with a red oak handle, in exchange for the mending of his 3 work shirts and the linen cuffs of his good Sunday coat. From a freighter laid up with a sprained wrist, she got the use of a 2-man cross-cut saw and a 1-inch auger, in exchange for the hemming of his overland duster. From the widow of a placer miner who had died the year before she got, for 50 cents, and a promise to come back and patch her quilt before Christmas, a small, square cast-iron stove of the Franklin pattern that her husband had used in his summer cabin up the creek, and that she had no further use for. The stove weighed 85 pounds. Cora and the widow's grown nephew dragged it to the Icehouse on a borrowed sledge. By the 18th of November, she had the tools she needed, and she had a stove on the limestone shelf. And the snow had come for the first time in earnest the night before. She began with the door. The original door was sound, but thin, and the gap underneath it admitted a draft she could feel against her ankles 4 feet inside the building. She cut a 6-inch strip of cottonwood with the froe, dressed it with the draw knife on the limestone shelf, and pegged it with hand-shaped oak pins as a thick threshold sill, raising the floor at the doorway by 2.5 inches so that the door now closed against a hardwood lip. She stuffed the gap above the door with shredded cedar bark soaked in a slurry of river clay and smoothed the result into a tight seal. Then, working with the auger and a chisel, she cut mortises into the inside frame of the door at 4 points, 6 inches above and below the hinges and the latch, and set into them 4 short oak pegs that would receive a second inner door of her own making. The inner door took her 3 days. She split the planks for it from a single straight-grained piece of cedar from the deadfall by the creek, riving them with the froe and the mallet a 1/4 inch at a time, dressing them with the draw knife on the shingle horse Otto Reichert lent her, and pegging them together with hand-shaped oak dowels into a slab door 1.5 inches thick, weighted with a horizontal cross plank, hung on hand-forged hinges Otto made for her in trade, for another half-day of mending. Between the inner door and the outer door, a 6-inch dead air space. Between the slabs of the inner door, a 1/2-inch cavity she filled with sawdust and shredded newspaper. She worked next on the ice-loading hatch. The opening was 20 inches square. She framed it with split cedar from the inside, pegged the frame, and packed the cavity behind the frame with a mixture of river clay, cut prairie grass, and fresh sod cut from the south side of the rise behind the Icehouse. The technique was an old German peasant one Otto Reichert had described to her in his slow, careful English the second day she went to his forge, and she trusted it because he had built 3 winter cellars by the same method along the freight road, and none of them had ever frozen through. Over the inner face of the sealed hatch, she nailed a single sheet of heavy oilcloth bought from the dry goods store, with the last 25 cents she had to her name. The whole assembly, when she was finished, was 11 inches thick and gave back, when she pressed the back of her hand against it on the inside. No sense at all of the cold on the other side. By the end of November, she had been working 16 hours a day for 3 weeks. Her hands were cracked along the joints, and her shoulders were sore in a way they had not been since the year her father had her swing a maul on a fellow wedge. But the door was sealed, the hatch was sealed. The stove was set on a hearth of dry-laid limestone she had cut herself from a tumbled section of an abandoned mining flume up the creek. The stovepipe was vented up through the original ventilation shaft with a tin collar she had cut and crimped from the side of a discarded lard tin from the freight depot's burn pile, and the first long sleeping shelf, a structure of split cedar laid on top of stacked limestone block, 16 inches high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, ran along the inside face of the east wall in the space where the ice cutter's shelf had been. On the night of the 29th of November, with 3 inches of new snow on the ground and the temperature down to 17 below, Cora lit the first fire in the Franklin stove, closed both doors behind her, and slept 11 hours straight on the cedar shelf with her cloak over her and her grandmother's thimble on her finger. When she woke in the morning, the fire had burned down to coals, and the air inside the ice house, against any reasonable expectation, was 41 degrees. It was Buford Hayes, the stage clerk, who found her first. He had been told by a teamster passing through the freight depot that there was smoke coming out of the old ice house on the north edge of town and that it had been coming out steady for a week. And Buford Hayes, who was a thin-faced, narrow-shouldered man of 35 with a mustache he was very proud of, and an opinion of his own importance that exceeded his actual importance by some margin, had pulled on his good coat and walked the half-mile up Main Street through 6 inches of fresh snow to satisfy himself about the rumor. He arrived at the ice house on the 2nd day of December at a little after 10 in the morning, knocked on the door, and was answered by Cora Whitfield in a clean apron, with her hair pinned, her sleeves rolled up to the elbow, and a streak of clay across her right cheek where she had been pressing chinking into a final seam in the stovepipe collar. He stepped past her without being invited and looked around the interior of the ice house for the better part of a minute. He looked at the inner door. He looked at the sealed hatch. He looked at the stove with its tin pipe rising into the ceiling. He looked at the cedar sleeping shelf along the east wall. He looked at the smoothed, packed earth floor with the small, round mat of woven cattail rush in the center where she had rested her feet of an evening. Then he looked at her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his mustache twitched in a way that he believed to be amused, but that read on his face as merely sour. "You cannot mean to live in here. This is an ice house. This is quite literally a house meant for ice. You will freeze to death by Christmas, and the county will be obliged to dig you out of a snowdrift come spring. Take the next stage. The freight company will advance you the fare. I will see to it personally." Cora looked at him without speaking. She picked up a clay pot from beside the stove, dipped a tin cup into it, and offered him the cup. There was hot water in it, with a little dried mint from the boarding house garden she had pulled in October, before Mrs. Pike had thrown her out. Buford Hayes took the cup, drank from it, found it was warm, and looked at her with an expression he could not quite get under control. He left 20 minutes later and was at the boarding house by noon. Mrs. Pike came up to look at the ice house the next afternoon with Lavinia Crane, the doctor's wife, on her arm. They did not knock. They walked around the outside of the building 3 times, examining the seam where the earth roof met the stone wall, examining the chimney pipe, examining the door, and then came together in front of the door and stood looking at it without speaking for a long minute. Then Mrs. Pike turned to Lavinia Crane and spoke loud enough to be heard through any wall the wind in Bannack could cross. She'll be in my woodshed by January, mark me. The girl has the mind of a sparrow. There is a reason no one has lived in that hole in 3 years, and the reason is that no one is fool enough to try." Lavinia Crane, who was a smaller, prettier, paler woman, with a habit of tilting her head when she was about to say something cruel, tilted her head and said, "It is rather a pity. She has good hands. She might have done well as a maid in a proper house." Then the two of them turned and walked back down the freight road toward town in a satisfied silence. Cora was inside, sitting on the cedar shelf, mending a torn pocket on Otto Reichert's second work shirt. She heard every word through the inner door. She did not move. She finished the seam, knotted the thread, bit it off with her teeth, set the shirt aside, and went on to the next one. Her face did not change. The stove ticked quietly in its corner. Outside, the wind off the divide was beginning to pick. 3 months later, every one of them would be standing at her door in the worst storm the valley had seen since the founding of the territory, and not one of them would be smiling. By the second week of December, the cold had settled in for the season, and the work shifted from the structural to the thermal. Cora had warmth and shelter sufficient to hold her through an ordinary frontier winter. What she did not yet have was the depth of insulation that would hold a building against a storm of the kind the older men around the freight stove at the depot had begun to mutter about. There had not been a real storm in the Beaverhead Valley, the old men said, since the spring of '72. The valley was overdue. Cora listened to them when she went down to mend, and she came home and added another 2 weeks of work to her plan. The technique she used for the inner walls was the one Otto Reichert had described to her in his slow, methodical English over the small forge fire on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of November. In the old country, he said, the peasant winter cellars had been double-walled with a packed cavity of dry sawdust and shredded straw between an outer stone wall and an inner wall of woven willow daubed with clay. The cavity held the warmth the way a quilt holds it, by trapping a thickness of dead air between two surfaces. And the trick was that the cavity had to be dry, packed firm but not compressed, and sealed top and bottom against vermin and against settling. A wet cavity would rot, freeze, and fail. A dry cavity would hold a man's room at livable through a week of 50 below. She did not have willow withies in the quantity she needed, and she did not have lath. What she had, in plenty, was the dry goods crates the freight depot threw out behind the corral every Friday, and the stacks of old newspapers Mrs. Pike's late husband had collected for 30 years, and which Mrs. Pike, after a brief negotiation conducted through Otto Reichert as intermediary in exchange for the mending of all of Mrs. Pike's table linen for the rest of the winter, had been willing to release. By the 15th of December, Cora had moved by handcart almost 200 pounds of old newsprint from a dry corner of the boarding house carriage shed to the Icehouse, along with about as much again of dry pine sawdust, swept from the floor of Otto Reichert's forge over the course of the previous month and saved for her in burlap sacks. She built the inner wall by splitting cedar shake stock with the froe and pegging it horizontally to a frame of light pine. She nailed up against the inside face of the original fieldstone, leaving a 4-inch cavity between the stone and the cedar all the way around the 4 walls of the building. Into the cavity, working from the bottom up, she packed alternating layers of shredded newsprint and dry pine sawdust, tamping each layer firm with a wooden tamper she shaped from a length of hickory. She sealed the bottom of the cavity against mice with a course of fresh burnt lime from Otto Reichert's slaking trough, and she capped the top of the cavity, where the cedar met the wall plate, with besagt wurde cedar, with a tight ribbon of clay and grass daub. Over the inner cedar she fastened a layer of woven reed mats. Cattail rush gathered from the slough below the creek, woven flat in the long evenings on the cedar shelf, 2 mats wide and 2 high to a wall, pegged with small bone needles she had whittled down from the bones of a deer Otto Reichert had given her half of after a hunt. The reed mats served 2 purposes. They trapped a thin, further cushion of dead air between themselves and the cedar, and they finished the interior in a tight, warm, light-colored surface that brightened the dim interior of the building and reflected the light of her oil lamp. The pattern of the wall layering, stone outside, cavity, cedar, reed mat, was Otto Reichert's German cellar pattern. The pattern of the reed mat finish, with the layered weave that pinned a single thin layer of shredded grass between the courses of cattail, was a technique she had observed 2 summers earlier when a small Bannack family had camped for 3 days on the far side of Grasshopper Creek, and a Bannack woman had sat in the late August sun, mending a mat of exactly this kind. Cora had watched her hands for a long while across the creek that summer, and had asked her, through a freighter who spoke a little of the language, what the grass was for, and had received the answer that the grass held the cold off the hand when the mat was laid against the outside of a winter wick-up. Cora had remembered the answer. She used it now. Whatever heat she would later be praised for in the Icehouse was, in part, owed to the patient work of a Bannack woman, whose name she never learned, and Cora never afterward let the credit for the warmth of those reed walls fall to her own ingenuity alone. The stove she rebuilt the hearth for. The original limestone was sound, but the firebox sat too low, and she lifted it on a course of dry-laid stone 2 more high, so that the heat of the body of the stove would warm the air at sleeping height rather than at floor height. She rerouted the stovepipe to make a single slow horizontal traverse of 6 feet inside the building before turning up into the original ventilation shaft, so that the iron of the pipe gave off its heat into the room rather than into the outside air, in the same principle by which the Russian peasant masonry stove warmed a peasant cottage by drawing the smoke through a long maze of stone before allowing it to escape. She did not call it that. She called it nothing at all. She simply lengthened the pipe and wrapped the horizontal run in a shell of clay and straw daub fingerprint thick, so that the pipe became, in effect, a small stone bench warm to the touch for hours after the fire had burned down. She solved the water problem by digging a small spring-fed seep at the corner of the rise behind the Icehouse and lining it with 3 flat fieldstones into a basin the size of a wash bowl, covering the basin with a board. She solved the food problem by hanging her cured meat, a flank of antelope from a freighter's surplus, a string of rabbits she snared along the creek, a half-wheel of hard cheese traded for 2 days of mending, from a length of cord stretched along the underside of a roof purlin, and by burying her flour and her cornmeal in tin pails sunk into the cool packed earth of the floor in the building's southwest corner, where the cold of the surrounding earth kept them dry and free of weevil. By Christmas Day she had been 3 weeks and a day inside the building. She lit a candle on the cedar shelf, ate a small Christmas supper of antelope stew and cornbread, and read aloud to herself from her grandmother's Bible the 2nd chapter of Luke. The wind that night was steady out of the north at a temperature of 23 below, and the air inside the Icehouse, 6 inches above the surface of the cedar shelf, was 62 degrees. The first sign came in the last week of January. The geese, which should long since have been gone south, came back. A small flight of them passed over the freight road on the morning of the 28th, low, not above the divide, but at the height of a man's chimney, flying south in a tight, urgent V, with their wings working hard against a sky the color of old iron. An old placer miner who had been in the Bitterroot country since '63 and who lived in a one-room shack behind the assayer's office came out of his door in his sock feet and stood watching the geese until they were out of sight. When his neighbor asked him what he was looking at, he said only that there was something coming down off the divide that even those birds knew to run from. The second sign came on the 2nd of February. The cattle in the holding pen behind the stage barn, 22 head, mostly thin-range steers held over for spring drive, broke down a section of the rail in the night and bunched at the south end of the pen against the windbreak, as tight together as a single animal, and would not be moved by any amount of shouting. A teamster who had wintered cattle in 3 territories told Buford Hayes that he had seen cattle do that twice before in his life, and that the second time he had buried 2 men. Buford Hayes laughed at him. 2 days later, Buford Hayes would not be laughing. The third sign came on the morning of the 8th of February. The wind off the divide, which had blown steady out of the northwest for a week at a moderate cold, fell off entirely a little after dawn. The smoke from the chimneys in town rose straight up. The temperature, which had been 11 below at first light, climbed to 22 above by 10 in the morning. The old placer miner, asked at the freight depot what the warming meant, said the same thing he had been saying since the geese. It meant the storm was drawing in its breath. The town had begun, very quietly, to take him seriously. Cora was in the Icehouse that morning. She had heard about the cattle from a freighter who came to her with a torn wagon canvas to mend on the morning of the 3rd. She had seen the geese herself 2 days before that. She had felt the unnatural warming of the morning of the 8th on her cheek when she went out to break the ice on her spring basin and bring in an armful of cordwood from the long stack along the south wall. She did not need anyone to interpret the signs for her. By noon on the 8th of February, she had carried in from her cordwood stack 4 full ricks, more than she had thought she needed for the week, stacked them along the inside of the inner door and beside the stove. She had filled the spring basin with 3 buckets of water and set the buckets along the warm, horizontal stovepipe shelf so they would not freeze. She had taken down the antelope flank and the rabbits and rehung them on a fresh cord at sleeping shelf height where they could be reached without leaving the warm column of the stove. She had checked every seam of the inner door, every peg of the sealed hatch, every cap of the wall cavity. She had laid in by the stove a tin of dry tinder, a flint and steel in a small pouch, a stub of beeswax candle, a length of thin oil-soaked cord, and a handful of pine pitch for emergency starting. She had cut and laid out on the cedar shelf 6 lengths of clean linen torn from a worn-out sheet, the kind of strips a country woman cuts ahead, because she knows a hard winter sometimes asks for bandages in a hurry. She had filled the small kettle. She had filled the large kettle. She had pulled from the southwest corner of the floor the tin pail of flour and the tin pail of cornmeal, and set them where she could reach them in the dark. That night she said her grandmother's grace at the cedar shelf, ate a small supper of cornmeal mush with a little tallow, and turned in early. She slept lightly. At a little before 3 in the morning of the 9th of February of 1880, in a stillness that was not the stillness of peace, but the long-held breath that comes before the blow falls, Cora Whitfield woke up. She lay on her back on the cedar shelf in the warm, dim glow of the banked stove and listened. There was nothing yet. There was no wind at all. The chimney pipe was silent. The candle did not flicker. She waited. And then, far up the divide, a long, low note began, like the lowest string of a fiddle drawn out under a heavy bow, and it grew, and it kept growing, and by 3:30 in the morning the storm had broken over the Beaverhead Valley like a hand brought down flat against a table. The first day of the storm, the 9th of February, was the day the wind announced itself. By 6 in the morning, the air outside Cora's outer door had risen to a steady 55-mile-an-hour gust, with a temperature she could not measure, but which the old placer miner, who survived the storm in a root cellar dug into a hillside, would later put at 30 below by sunrise, and 40 below by noon. The snow came with the wind, not from the sky but sideways, fine and dry and granular as sand. And the daylight that filtered through the louvered cap of the ventilation chimney did not reach above a dim gray by noon. In Bannack proper, at the south end of Main Street, the new frame house of the assayer lost its tar paper roof in a single clap at 9:15, and its family, 6 souls, fled to the meeting house through a wind that knocked the youngest boy off his feet 3 times. The Goodrich Hotel held, but its top floor was uninhabitable by mid-morning. The boarding house of Mrs. Pike held, but every window on the north face had to be stuffed with quilts to keep the snow from blowing in around the casings. In the icehouse on the cedar shelf, with the inner door sealed and the stove drawing steady on a moderate fire, Cora ate a breakfast of cornmeal and tallow and drank a cup of hot mint water and read the 8th Psalm to herself from her grandmother's Bible. And the air around her stood at 58 degrees. The second day was the day the cold came in earnest. The wind dropped, in the way of the worst storms, to a steady freight train roar without gusts, and the temperature fell. By the thermometer, the old placer miner was watching in the lee of his shack. From 40 below at sunrise to 52 below by noon, and by sundown he could no longer get a reading because the mercury was at the bottom of the bulb and would not rise from it. 2 miners who had bunked together in a tar paper shack at the foot of the dredge tailings were found 3 days later still in their bunks with their boots on, frozen solid in the position of sleep. The doctor, called out to a laboring woman at the south end of town, lost a horse in a drift on the way, and barely got his own self back. His wife Lavinia Crane, sent with a kettle of hot soup to the freighter Buford Hayes, who had taken to his bed with a fever the night before, found her hands numb to the wrist by the time she made the 8 blocks back, and 3 of her fingers turned the color of wet ash by the candle that night. In the icehouse, Cora kept the stove on a small, steady fire and held the air at 56 degrees through the worst of the second day. The fire would draw down and she would feed it. She slept in 2-hour stretches, woke, fed the stove, listened to the wind, and slept again. The third day was the day the structures began to fail in town. The assayer's house collapsed altogether at a little after 11 in the morning, the second-story wall folding inward under the weight of 3 feet of drift. The freight barn lost half its roof at noon. The Methodist meeting house, packed by then with 23 souls, including the assayer's family and the half-frozen family from a failed shack on the freight road, ran out of cordwood at 3 in the afternoon and began burning the pews. Mrs. Pike's boarding house held its walls but lost its woodshed in the night, and her remaining lodgers, 3 commercial travelers who had been caught in town by the storm, moved with her into the parlor and burned, by the morning of the 4th day, every piece of furniture in the building that was not strictly necessary to sit on. In the icehouse, Cora ate cornmeal mush and a strip of dried antelope, drank her hot mint water, and read aloud the 90th Psalm to herself in the quiet lamplight, because the sound of her own voice steadied her, and because she had begun, on the 3rd afternoon, to hear something through the wind that she could not at first identify. It was a knocking. It was faint, and it was uneven, and at first she thought it was a loose shake on the roof. Then she thought it was the wind in the chimney. Then she sat up on the cedar shelf and listened, and she knew. Someone was at her door. She had a decision to make. Inside the icehouse, with both doors sealed and the wall cavity holding, she could ride out a storm of any length the territory had ever produced. To open the door, even the inner one, to investigate, would lose her. In the time it took to cross the threshold and back, a day's worth of stove heat. To open both doors would be a serious matter. She sat for the length of 3 slow breaths on the cedar shelf, with her grandmother's thimble pressed against her lower lip in the way she had developed in the last 3 months for thinking through a hard thing. Then she stood up, took the small kettle off the stove, set it where it would not boil dry, pulled her cloak around her, and went to the door. She unlatched the inner door first and held it against her hip with her left hand, while she lifted the heavy plank latch of the outer door with her right. The wind hit the outer door and tried to take it out of her grip. She set her shoulder against it and pushed it back, and standing in the gap of the storm, on the windward side of the freight road, with snow up to his knees and a horse blanket thrown over his head and shoulders, and his beard a single solid white sheet of frozen breath, was the freighter Tom Beasley, who had taken 3 of his children to the meeting house on the first morning and had now waded 1.25 miles back through the storm with the youngest child, a girl of 4. Wrapped against his chest under the blanket because the meeting house had run out of fuel, and the child had begun to go quiet in a way that meant she was dying. Cora pulled them inside. She closed both doors behind them. She took the child from him and laid the child not by the stove, which would have been the wrong move, would have shocked the small heart, but along the warm horizontal stovepipe shelf, wrapped in her own cloak, and rubbed the child's hands and feet very slowly and very steadily with her own. The freighter sat on the cedar shelf and could not stop shaking for the better part of 20 minutes. She gave him a tin cup of hot mint water with a spoon of antelope tallow stirred into it. He drank it. He did not look at her face. He said into the cup the words he had been saying to himself the whole long mile through the storm. I told them. I told them you had built it right. I told them. Within the hour there was a second knock. The freighter Beasley's wife, with their 2 older children. Within 2 hours, 3 more. A placer miner and his wife and their adolescent son, who had been turned out of a mine timber shack that had begun to lose its roof beams. By sundown of the 3rd day, the Icehouse held 9 souls, and Cora had moved the cooking from the top of the stove to a single small hot stone. She pulled from the side of the firebox so that she could keep the stove door closed and the heat in the body of the iron. And she had taken every blanket in the building and laid them out on the packed earth floor in 3 rows, so that her guests could sleep in 3 shifts of 3 on the cedar shelf, and on the floor by the stove. The 4th day was the worst day. The wind reached its peak in the small hours of the morning, and the temperature, by the old placer miner's later reckoning, touched 62 below the 0 mark just before dawn. Cora walked the cavity walls every hour with the back of her hand, feeling for any cold spot, and found none. The reed mats stood at the temperature of a cool kitchen wall. The sealed hatch was slightly cooler but dry. The doors held. The stove drew. The air in the building, 6 inches above the cedar shelf where the older woman from the placer miner's family slept, held at 47 degrees through the worst hour and rose again to 52 by sunrise. Mrs. Pike came on the morning of the 4th day. She came not on her own feet, but on the back of the doctor, who had given up on his own house, and brought to Cora's door, in a single long, staggering walk through the broken streets of Bannack, his patient wife Lavinia Crane, on a hand-pulled sled, and Mrs. Pike behind him in a sort of shuffling lean, with 3 fingers of her right hand black to the second joint, with her square-set face drawn under her shawl, and with her eyes on the door of the Icehouse the whole way, as if it were the only door left in the world, which, as far as the north end of Bannack was concerned, by the morning of the 12th of February, it was. Cora opened the door and helped them both inside without a word. She set Lavinia Crane on the cedar shelf nearest the stove. She set Mrs. Pike on the warm, horizontal stovepipe shelf with her bad hand wrapped in a clean linen strip soaked in hot tallow. The doctor she set by the door with the second-best blanket because the doctor was a tall man and could take cold longer than the women. Mrs. Pike did not speak for the better part of an hour. The fingers came back to a deep, angry purple by midday, which the doctor said meant she would keep the hand, though not the 2 end joints, of the smallest 2. By the afternoon, she could move her shoulders again, and her square, heavy face had taken on some color. She watched Cora work, quietly, steadily, hour after hour, ladling out cornmeal mush, boiling water, turning the antelope, adjusting the stove. For the rest of the day without speaking. At dusk, when the wind began at last to drop, Mrs. Pike spoke from her place on the warm shelf. She did not turn her head. She said it into the dim, warm air of the icehouse so that everyone in the building heard her without anyone being looked at. I was wrong, child. I was wrong about you in every particular. There is no kind of penance I can do that will balance this account. But if there is breath in me come the spring, I will spend the rest of it trying. Cora looked up from the stove. She did not say anything. She nodded once, slowly, the way her grandmother had nodded when an apology was made and accepted in the kitchen of the farmhouse outside Cedar Falls. Then she turned back to the pot and stirred it. The storm broke at a little after midnight on the morning of the 13th of February. The wind dropped from a roar to a whisper in the space of 10 minutes, and then to nothing at all, and the silence that settled over the Beaverhead Valley was the deepest silence anyone in Bannack had ever heard. Buford Hayes, the stage clerk, who had been 3 days delirious with fever in the parlor of Mrs. Pike's boarding house and had only recovered enough to walk on the morning of the 13th, was the first man in town to put on a coat and a pair of borrowed snowshoes and stagger up the freight road through 5-foot drifts to see, with his own eyes, what he had heard rumored, that the Icehouse on the north edge of town had taken in 12 souls and held them all alive through the worst hour. He stood on the threshold of the inner door at 10 in the morning of the 13th, with his thin face white and his mustache rimed with frost, and he looked at the room, and he looked at Cora, and he said it loud enough for every man and woman in the building to hear him. Miss Whitfield, I called you a sparrow-brained child in this very valley not 3 months ago. I take it back. I take it back in front of every soul in this county. There is no warmer building in this valley today, and there is no smarter one. I am sorry. Cora wiped her hands on her apron, walked across the warm, dim room, and held out her hand to him. He took it. His grip was cold and shaking. Hers was warm and steady and small. The 12 souls she had taken in stayed 5 days. By the 18th of February, when the sun had burned through the last of the cloud and the freight road was just barely passable to a man on snowshoes, the families went home in the order they had come. The doctor measured the air in the icehouse before he left by an old mercury thermometer he had carried in his coat, 61 degrees, against an outside reading of 14 below. Of every structure in Bannack still standing on the morning of the 13th of February of 1880, the doctor recorded the icehouse as the warmest by a margin of 19 degrees, and the only one within 4 miles that had not lost cordwood, roof, or a member of its household to the cold. The county newspaper, when at last it printed the storm in its issue of the 28th of February, gave Cora Whitfield 3 lines on the second page, and her grandmother's surname misspelled. The town gave her more. By the spring of 1880, she was running, out of the limestone shelf inside the icehouse, a small mending and tailoring trade that took in the better part of $3 a day. And by the autumn of that year, Otto Reichert had built her a small attached forge room of fieldstone along the south wall, in exchange for the right to share the chimney for his own off-season work. By 1883, the building had grown into a long, low compound of 3 connected stone rooms, and Cora had hired 2 girls from the placer miner families to help with the trade, and the boarding house women who had once measured her in 3 days came to her now for their fittings, and called her, with a careful respect, Miss Whitfield. Mrs. Pike kept her promise. She lived another 11 years, and she gave Cora the use of her north shed, the use of her good linen press, a standing line of credit at the dry goods store in her name, and, on a still Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1885, the deed to the half-acre of land on which the icehouse stood, which she had quietly purchased from the dissolved partnership 2 years earlier and held in her name against this exact moment. Cora kept the deed in a tin box on the limestone shelf for the rest of her life. Buford Hayes stood up in the meeting house on the first Sunday of March of 1880 and told the congregation, in a voice that did not shake, what he had said, and what he had been wrong about, and he did not speak ill of another soul in Bannack for the remaining 24 years of his life. Lavinia Crane lost the 2 outer joints of 3 fingers and learned to stitch with the others, and brought Cora her first piece of mending in the spring, a torn collar on her husband's good Sunday coat, and laid the coat down on the limestone shelf without speaking and without looking up. Cora Whitfield never married. She lived in the Icehouse, though by then it was no longer an icehouse, and no longer called one, but Whitfield simply by the freight men and the placer wives and the children for the rest of her natural life. She died in 1929 at the age of 67, in a small bed built into the same limestone shelf where she had slept her first nights wrapped in her cloak in November of '79, and she was buried in the small Bannack cemetery beside the meeting house, under a flat stone with her name and her years, and a single line that the stonecutter had cut at her instruction the year before her death. She built warm where they had built cold. The Icehouse stood. It stood through the great storm of 1887, the influenza winter of 18, the long drought of the 30s, and the slow emptying of the town through the second half of the 20th century. By the time Bannack itself was made a Montana State Park in 1954, the Icehouse was one of the oldest continuously roofed buildings in the settlement, and the children of the Rangers grew up knowing the story before they knew the names of any of the territorial governors. Travelers crossing the Beaverhead Divide on the freight road even now can stand at the north end of the old town and see the low, half-buried rectangle of fieldstone with the slow, earth-mounded roof and the narrow north door. And the ones who know the story will tell the ones who do not, quietly, the way her own grandmother's stories were told, about the 18-year-old girl who walked out of Mrs. Pike's boarding house in the first snow of November with a thimble in her cloak and walked into a building everyone in the territory had forgotten and built a warm place inside it that kept 12 neighbors and a 4-year-old child alive on the worst night in the recorded history of the valley. The frontier did not reward the loudest voice or the strongest back. It rewarded the woman who saw clearly when everyone else was looking the other way, and who lifted her tools without waiting for permission, and who opened her door to the same neighbors who had thrown her trunk into the road. If you would like more forgotten stories of frontier women and men who outbuilt, outlasted, and outsmarted every soul who doubted them, subscribe to Frontier People. We've got a new story every week, pulled straight from the homestead records and the family Bibles most people forgot existed. We'll see you in the next one.